Ndongo is a research and program manager for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and he has written a great deal about money. He's co-author of Africa's Last Colonial Currency and works as head of the Rosa Luxemburg's Program Foundation. He is also the author of The Fair Trade Scandal, Marketing Poverty to Benefit the Rich. And I just add on a personal note that I'm very envious because Ndongo, I believe, studied with and worked closely with Samir Amin. So Ndongo, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Radhika. It's great to be here among all of you. With your authorization, I will share my screen.
Yes, sorry, let me find you and make you co-host. Just 1 second, please.
The narrative that the inflation we are witnessing, for example, in Africa, is largely due to the war in Ukraine. There have been a number of recent writings by the World Bank, the IMF, saying that, well, Africans will die of hunger because of what is happening in Ukraine. I think it is a way of finding, let's say, excuses for the, for the wrong policies they recommended and imposed over African countries. So I basically show some graph in order to try to challenge this labor organization, which shows that there had been what the topic of the conference called the return of inflation, that between, let's say, the March 2019 to now, there have been a significant increase of inflation worldwide. But the experiences have been very different from one region to another. For example, in the case of Europe and Northern America, you could see clearly that the inflation started to rise continuously from January last year, from, for example, 2% to current year. And this applies as well for all items and food and non-alcoholic beverages, which you could see in red. In the case, for example, of Latin America and the Caribbean, you have more or less the same pattern, but inflation started to increase before, let's say, by October 2020, and it increased until January, and yeah, still increasing. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, it's a different story, because even before the pandemic, we already had inflation, significant rates of inflation. And you could see in this graph that on January 2019, we have something like 8% of inflation, average inflation for Sub-Saharan Africa. And at the beginning of January 2022, we had something like 24%. And you see the two graphs are really close one another. The graph for all the items and the one for the food and non-alcoholic beverages. So this shows clearly that the war in Ukraine could have been a compounding factor, but it has not created most of the inflation we are now witnessing. This is something due to the way the pandemic has been managed or ill-managed in the global north. But nonetheless, the war in Ukraine had a significant impact on a number of African countries. And this is due to the fact that Russia practically exports everything from food, fertilizer, industrial inputs, agricultural products. This is a graph derived from the Atlas of Economic Complexity, and the data concern the year 2019. You could see that Russia exported something like 440 billion US dollar and had a trade surplus of 64.8 billion. So Russia practically exports everything. You would not clearly see in this graph Russia's exports of wheat, for example. In 2019, it accounted just for 1.4% of all of Russia's exports, and represented in absolute value something like less than 7 billion But despite these low numbers, we'll see that this is highly significant as an, let's say, major exporter of wheat. And the sources of inflation that the Global South is facing following this war, the start of this war, for me, there are five sources. The first is fuel, because we have seen that there had been an increase in the prices of oil and gas. Russia is a major exporter of fertilizer, and this has an impact on agricultural productivity, obviously. Food also, freight, because the cost of freight have increased, and also access to finance, because in the meantime, we have seen also that the costs of foreign finance have increased for most African countries. So all these four Fs, the five Fs, they combine to create significant inflation, in addition to what African countries were living, let's say, before the start of this war. You could see is graphs from the IMF that with the start of this war, there had been an increase of major commodities, oil, natural gas, the metals, and also wheat. You could see that clearly. For food products, the rising prices started before the war, but it has continued with the war. Here you have graphs from the UNCTAD, and which shows the global role played by both Russia and Ukraine. They represent a significant amount of the global exports of corn, of colza seeds, barley, wheat, and also sunflower and seeds. Of what is more African perspective is the high dependence from many African countries from the wheat exported on exports from these two countries, starting with Eritrea, who imports 33% of its wheat from Russia, to Somalia, which just imports everything from these two countries. And this kind of evidence has
Ndongo, can you hear us?
Yeah, his audio was very unstable. He might have dropped out.
Just gonna give him a minute to see, a few seconds to see if he can come back. But otherwise, what we might do is I will email him. We will go to the next speaker, and then we'll see if he can rejoin us.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry for.
Oh, great. Continue, please.
I don't know where I stopped, but yeah.
I think you were at the graph with the sideways graph with the yeah, that one. Yeah.
This one, okay.
No, previous one. The one you showed earlier. No, down.
Okay.
Yeah, that one, yes.
Okay. Yeah, in this graph, you could see that there are at least 25 African countries which are highly dependent on exports from Russia and Ukraine, exports of wheat, starting from Eritrea, 33% to Somalia, 100%. This kind of evidence has given rise to many comments from the IMF, World Bank, and other people saying that there is a looming food crisis in this war, etc. But the thing is, in that narrative, they never say why African countries do not have, let's say, their food sovereignty, because in most African countries, the labor force is majoritarily working in the agricultural sector. So what explains that African countries themselves are not let's say, able to feed their own populations. And I think this has to do with the free trade policies, which the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization have been, let's say, recommending African countries to follow. And you could see that clearly with this draft. And their discourse is always to say that, well, they don't need food sovereignty, but at least something they call food security, in the sense that they could rely on markets to feed themselves. That means that they have only to export, for example, oil or other basic commodities, so as to find the foreign exchange and just to buy the food they need, but they do not need necessarily to be a net food exporter, for example. So in this narrative, they never take into account responsibility of IMF, World Bank, and the WTO in this kind. Say, in fact, that there had been in some countries food riots, food crisis, because in fact the IMF had been urging governments to follow what they call fiscal consolidation and the removal of subsidies on the, let's say, the basic grants, let's say, consumed by the people, or at least people from urban settings. Currently in Africa, you have 36 countries ranked by the AO, and among them there are only two which are, let's say, oil. What Sudan even is not an oil exporter, because oil, let's say, exported by South Sudan. And Sudan is a very interesting case, because
Ndongo, if I may just briefly interrupt, if you have no more pictures to show, maybe if you turn off your video, we can hear your presentation better, because you're breaking up and because your bandwidth is low. This may be a better solution. Okay. What do you think? Yeah.
Okay. I had finished, I think. I was just giving the case of Sudan, because in fact, they follow IMF advice to remove subsidies for food, and strong protest, which led to the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir. After that, Sudan normalized its relationships with the West, and US sanctions against Sudan were removed. But the thing is that they still continue to, let's say, to say to government to remove food and food subsidies. The same, let's say, organizations that are saying that what is happening in Africa is due to the war in Ukraine. In fact, before that, they were advising government to remove food and food subsidies. So it is clear that the war in Ukraine has compounded Sudan's problems, but the neoliberal policies imposed on those countries have been the negative. So in conclusion, I would just say quickly that the so-called return of inflation, because in many African countries, inflation source production based on low-cost labor is in crisis. When the globalized labor force ceases to work, inflation, the trade has failed the countries that accepted to become net food importers, like some of the African countries. The idea also that central banks with more independence can tackle inflation also has shown its limitations with this current crisis. And monetary policy, as Chandra said, is a very blunt tool to address the current issues. Another observation is that Western economic and financial sanctions are generally counterproductive and self-defeating when they are targeted against major exporters of global critical goods, like, for example, Russia or maybe China one day. African countries are caught in a difficult situation to stabilize their economies, their exchange rate, and debt in foreign currency. But sooner or later, the foreign debt will have to be repaid, which requires fiscal consolidation in the language of the IMF. So the issue for them is how long they will be able to postpone deflationary adjustment. Thank you for your attention. These were my initial inputs.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.